Hello and welcome, everyone. It's just a little music to set the mood for this evening's Manuscript Monday. So, welcome, friends and colleagues, to this month's edition. We're very excited to have you with us to share this special lecture. Tonight we have Susan Leahy joining us live, and we're going to learn a bit about some different manuscripts than you might have been used to or might be in your usual purvey of study. So my name is Lee Cathanis. I'll be the technical director and host for this Manuscript Monday Manuscript Society event. Before we get into the program, I would like to share a few notes. For those of you familiar with Zoom and our Zoom lectures, there's a chat box you see down there below. We're just going to go over a few of the items there. So if you use the chat there, you can speak with everyone now. So just adjust that. So if you want to let's say hi, give us a wave, let us know where you're joining us from. Love to see who's joining and where everybody is on this Monday. Next to that, you'll see a Q&A box. So Susan's here with us live. We have a pre-recorded lecture, but Susan's going to be here to answer some questions live with us. So if you come up with anything during the thing, during this lecture, please feel free to put that in the Q&A box there, and we will get to those questions live at the end when we have some time to go over that. As far as any technical support, I'm going to go ahead and drop my email in there. Feel free to drop a line if you're having trouble viewing or seeing anything there. With this Zoom lecture, you'll see a shared screen here. You'll see the shared video, and then you'll see us on the side as well. And you can adjust the bounds of that for a little bit bigger if you need to slide that across. So we'll keep going on to my next notes here. A bit about the Manuscript Society. The Manuscript Society is a nonprofit dedicated to collecting, researching, and preserving manuscripts and documents. Membership is open to everyone. There are different levels of membership available as well, and scholarship support is offered to graduate students through the Richard Maass Research Grant. Learn more at the Manuscript website, manuscript.org. And then we'll keep on moving on here. And I'll say a little bit about this event. So here this is what is on the site, and we'll read here. It says, in 1772, Emperor Qianlong of the Qing dynasty, China, a prolific poet, major art patron, and insatiable collector, commissioned the largest encyclopedic compilation of books in Chinese history. Within 10 years, a team of more than 350 scholars and hundreds of editors had compiled 36,381 volumes. That's over 2.3 million pages of the Siku Quanshu, also known as the complete library in 4 sections. Only 7 copies were made, 4 of which survive today in Chinese libraries. Tonight we learn more about this Wikipedia of Chinese literature, history, medicine, arts, science, philosophy, and classic Confucian texts, and its importance both then and now, including the process of selecting, editing, and censoring information. So with this, and forgive my pronunciation there, I'm learning some new words here from Susan, who's our expert. I'm going to go ahead and drop in the chat a very helpful glossary of Chinese terminology that Susan has put together for us. That should be coming into the chat there. Feel free to download that. Very helpful text to add some context here. And with that, let me introduce Susan more formally. So Susan Leahy is an award-winning certified appraiser of personal property specializing in Asian art. Her ability to read traditional Chinese characters allows her to identify and translate calligraphy and marks on fine and decorative Chinese art. She has been a member of the International Society of Appraisers for 14 years and is the former president of the Canadian chapter of the ISA. Ms. Leahy holds the honors BA in Chinese Studies from the University of Toronto, an MA with thesis in classical Chinese literature from the University of British Columbia, and a postgraduate diploma with distinction in Asian art from the School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London, England, and Sotheby's Educational Studies. Susan lived in Taipei, Taiwan for 2 years, continuing her Mandarin studies, and traveled extensively in Asia, studying Chinese art collections. She is the president of Eastern Art Consultants Incorporated, providing independent appraisal, research, and collection management services. Previously, she worked at the Royal Ontario Museum in various capacities and led the Asian Art departments of two Toronto auction houses. Ms. Lai is a highly sought after instructor of Asian ceramics and Chinese decorative art specialty courses. So we have the expert here. So with that, we're going to go into our previously recorded lecture that Susan gave, and we will come back from that to give some context and answer some questions. And we're very excited about this. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start our pre-recorded lecture. Enjoy.
Thank you for the invitation to speak to the Manuscript Society tonight. It's a pleasure to be here with you. You're probably used to discussing Western manuscripts, and so tonight there's going to be something completely different with regard to the Chinese culture and a manuscript called Siku Quanshu. I Googled the word manuscript, which I'm sure you all know, comes from the Latin word manuscriptus, meaning written by hand. And this description and definition certainly applies to probably the largest manuscript ever created, the Siku Quanshu, which means in English, when translated, the complete library of the four treasuries, or sometimes also is translated as four sections or four branches of literature. The questions that we're going to discuss tonight and find the answers to are, what is the Siku Quanshu? Who was the Emperor Qianlong? Why was it created? What are the four categories? And what is its significance, both past and present? The Siku Quanshu represents the largest encyclopedic compilation of books in Chinese history and has been referred to, as I quote, the most ambitious editorial enterprise before Wikipedia. It can also be seen as the most ambitious project to control information in pre-modern history. It involved more than 350 scholars, hundreds of editors, resulting in 36,381 volumes containing more than 79,000 chapters, approximately 2.3 million pages, and which was only surpassed in size by Wikipedia in 2010 in terms of volume in a single body of knowledge. This is a true reflection of a manuscript, as 7 copies were handwritten by hundreds of copyists. And they were written in the style of Kaishu, which is one of the 6 styles of Chinese script. And I have on the side of the slide, here in black, are the words Kaishu, and this is the way that the characters appear in the Siku Quanshu, and it is the type of print style that is used in modern Chinese writing. We're looking here at a slide which gives you a visual idea of the enormity of the Siku Quanshu. This was an exhibition that was put on for the public to engage with back in 2014 in Jiangsu, China. And the photo really does help get a visual impression of the size of it. And can you imagine hand copying all of these volumes of the books 7 times, which is what took place? Now, there are 7 copies that were handwritten by hundreds of copyists originally, and 4 of which survive to this day. In fact, special libraries were built just to house the Siku Quanshu, and several of them were located in various palaces so that the Emperor Qianlong would have access to them regardless of which palace he happened to be staying at the time. Of them, 3 were destroyed, and they were the victims of war and fire. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this image was a new reproduction of the complete library of Siku Quanshu that was on display. So this was a new reproduction copy here, shown in this slide. So tonight I'm going to introduce you to this compilation of Chinese information and literature, discuss the process of the compilation, which involves censorship, the 4 sections themselves, and highlight some of the most important books that it contains, and share its cultural and academic value. However, in order to understand the Siku Quanshu, we first need to discuss who was Emperor Qianlong and what motivated him to undertake this project. The Emperor Qianlong, and his name means lasting eminence, was in fact Manchurian and not Chinese. His true name, birth name, was Isen Gyoro Hongli. He was a Manchu. This is a critical fact for us to understand in order to understand the Siku Quanshu. Most Westerners consider China to be run by the Chinese. In fact, the Qing dynasty was a foreign one, and it was ruled by Manchus who were from the northeastern part of China. The previous dynasty, the Ming dynasty, was a Han dynasty ruled China. This ultimately is what was behind Qianlong's desire to compile the books, to eliminate anti-Manchu sentiment from the recorded history, as well as to demonstrate his right to be emperor, honor his Manchu ancestors, and preserve the Manchu heritage. He was, in fact, the fourth emperor of the Qing dynasty and reigned from 1735 to 1796 for 60 years, one of the longest reigning monarchs in history. He was a major patron of the arts, as well as a prolific poet, painter, and collector. His reign is noted for representing the pinnacle of quality in terms of porcelain, painting, and the arts, and he collected thousands of jades and bronzes. He had a reputation for being a successful military man who led many campaigns. He greatly expanded the Qing Empire, almost doubling it, and what was known as China, including western regions of modern-day Xinjiang, basically wiping out Western Mongol tribes and incorporating many non-Han people. He was credited with creating 18th century peace in China. But who were the Manchus? They were a people who in the 17th century conquered China. They were descended from a tribal confederation known in early Chinese records as the Eastern Barbarians. By the 10th century, they had established a kingdom in what was known as Manchuria. But when the Mongols swept to power in China, who were also foreign rulers from 1271 to 1368, they crushed most of the Jurchen people who were later known as Manchus. 3 centuries later, however, the Manchus made a serious comeback and they invaded and conquered China in 1644. The Manchu rulers of the Qing dynasty were patrons of Chinese art and literature, spoke Chinese themselves, and ironically in the West are considered Chinese. Still, they were very proud of their Manchu heritage and language, and they were descended from a nomadic people skilled in horseback riding, archery, and hunting. And here in the pictures that I've selected to illustrate who Emperor Qianlong was, we see on the side of the screen that the emperor is quite youthful, and he is seated on the throne, the imperial throne. And in the top corner, there is the red seal mark in archaic script of the Qianlong emperor. In the center of the slide, we have an image of the Qianlong emperor, much older, and he's in his studio. He's a scholarly gentleman mode, and you can see on his desk, he has a book, actually on his desk, as well as other writing implements and a piece of paper there, a vase, a white porcelain vase, there's a bronze gu-shaped vase, and there are other items that a scholarly gentleman would have on their desk in their studio. And then on the other side of the slide, we have him, again in more youthful mode, when he's in his full garments and regalia of being a military leader. And you can see the arrows, and you can see him on horseback, and all of these items reflect his background as a Manchurian. He was a skilled horseback rider, as well as a hunter and archer. So all I just wanted to mention, there's an interesting point here, that all of these paintings were done by an Italian Jesuit priest who lived in the imperial courts in Beijing. During that time, he had actually painted for the Emperor Qianlong's father and grandfather, and he served them as well as the Emperor Qianlong. And so his name was Giuseppe Castiglione, and he had a Chinese name which was Lang Shining. He eventually died in Beijing at a good age, but this is an interesting point, I think, to mention, is that the imperial court of the Emperor Qianlong was a very cosmopolitan one, and he was open to all sorts of ideas, both scientific and cultural, from other parts of the world. And there were many Jesuit priests from Italy, France, Germany, who were living and working for the emperor in the imperial court in Beijing. So simultaneously, Qianlong was also regarded as the preserver and restorer of traditional Chinese Confucian culture. He had a habit of persuading princes, literati, and members of the merchant and aristocratic classes of donating items to his art collection, such as jades. And so when he would persuade them to donate in quotes their works of art to his private collection, he would tell them things like, your works of art are safer from fire and theft if you lend them to me. I will take good care of them. And so when the emperor admired a work of art that you owned or heard about its beauty, when he asked to see it in person, the item had a funny way of staying with him in his collection. This can be seen. He also was a prolific poet and writer, and he personally wrote more than 40,000 poems. Now, many of which he had engraved on works of art, and he would add his own comments in calligraphy to paintings as well. Now, he's very prolific. He did write 40,000 poems, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have to remember that they were all of the highest quality of writing, but he had a reputation for being quite the art patron and poet and collector. And there is a story that I'd be happy to share with you at the end if we have time, which is about how the entire imperial collection of artworks almost ended up in the US and New York City with J.P. Morgan. Now, the Emperor Qianlong, as with all emperors, was extremely well educated. He could speak Manchu, which is a branch of the Altaic family of languages, Chinese and Mongolian, as well as Tibetan, because he was a devout Buddhist, and he could also speak Uyghur. Now, as I've mentioned before, the Manchus were incredible horsemen and hunters, and they also took on the study of traditional Chinese painting and poetry. So the Siku Quanshu, which the Qianlong Emperor made an edict to create, we now have a better historical context of understanding the Emperor Qianlong, and we're going to dive into this encyclopedic compilation. So the screen that we have in front of us now here is a slide which shows the 4 sections or treasuries. Previous to this edict, however, to create the Siku Quanshu project, the Qianlong Emperor had ordered the compilation of Manchu history and genealogies and a new Manchu dictionary, which included all the equivalents of other languages such as Mongolian and Turkic with Manchu words. He followed that up 30 years later, in 1772, with the proclamation of an edict to establish a team of scholars to compile, edit, and copy the largest collection of Chinese history, philosophy, and literature. As mentioned previously, when it was completed, it consisted of more than 36,000 volumes of approximately 3,450 books. But its ultimate goal was to erase anti-Manchu opinions from the private libraries of scholars and aristocrats, opinions that were held by those who were loyal to the Han Chinese perspective from the previous Ming Dynasty. Some of the books that were deemed anti-Manchu, or parts of books, involved approximately 2,300 works. The Manchus were referred to as barbarians in some of these texts. And it took about 10 years for the entire process to be completed of compiling these works. But it did not get off to a good start because there had been previous literary inquisitions where individuals suffered and had books confiscated and burned, so they weren't in a rush to submit their books to the emperor for his project. So because few books were arriving in the capital of Beijing to the Forbidden City, after about 3 months, the Emperor Qianlong made another edict, promising to return all books submitted, and there would be no penalties if there were anti-Manchu sentiments for the owners of such books submitted. So what happened though, however, was, as time would tell, the emperor did not keep his promise, and hundreds of books were burned secretly, and some book owners were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. It's important to note that this was certainly not the first time that books were burned in China. In fact, going back to the very first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, books were burned in 213 BC. This is the famous Qin Shi Huang emperor whose tomb, with the armies of life-size figures, is located in Xi'an, China, which you may be familiar with. The goal given to the scholars and editors by the emperor working on this project was to comb all libraries throughout the provinces for interesting material to be included in the series. The Siku Quanshu was based on books from the palace treasury in the Qing court, as well as parts of the Yongle encyclopedia from the Ming dynasty, the Yongle emperor in the 15th century. But the most critical new part was the submission of texts from private libraries from all over the empire. The emperor himself participated in reviewing and editing some of the texts. Every word or character, as they're referred to in Chinese, was copied by hand. The scribes and copyists were not paid, but rather they were rewarded with posts and improvements in their careers. Now, the slide that we're looking at right now demonstrates the 4 sections or treasuries of the complete works of the 4 branches of literature. And what are these 4 parts? It's interesting to note that before we discuss each one, that the 4 sections were color-coded. And so I have in the slide coded them according to the colors that they originally would have, which are green for Jingbu, Confucian classics, red for historiography, section number 2, Shibu. Number 3 is Zibu, which is Masters and Philosophers, which was in blue, and Jibu, part 4, which is belles-lettres and collections of writings. So the texts were written on folded paper, bound with thread into booklets. Each page had a red outline and was divided in half, and each section had 8 columns inscribed vertically with 21 characters or words. The first complete revised copy was finished in 1782. And the structure of the Siku Quanshu, these 4 sections, followed the traditional categories of literature that had been used since the Han Dynasty, from 206 BC to 220 AD. There are also 44 subcategories known as lei within each of these sections. So as I've mentioned, the Confucian classics were green, the historiography was red, the masters were blue, and the belles-lettres were gray. I'm going to talk about each of these sections, and I'm going to afterwards highlight some of the books in order to inspire those of you who are unfamiliar with Chinese history and literature to research further if you're interested. I picked some of the most famous examples. But for example, in the first section, Jingbu, Confucian Classics, there are listed, and these lists are not exhaustive. There are many, many more parts to each section, but I just highlighted the most important ones that I was familiar with and that I felt that were meaningful to the audience tonight. So under Confucian Classics, there's the Book of Changes, which is known in Chinese as I Ching, the Book of Songs, the Rites of the Zhou, Etiquette and Ceremonies, the Spring and Autumn Annals, and the Classic of Filial Piety, Etymology, and Dictionaries. In section 2 of history were the official dynastic histories, edicts and memorials, biographies, famous persons, regional histories, geography, palaces, capital cities, rivers and canals, frontier defense, historic places, descriptions of foreign countries, government official system, statecraft and administration, bibliographies, and catalogs. In the third section, the blue section of Masters and Philosophers, were Confucian books, military books, legalist treatises, agriculture and agronomy, medicine and pharmacology, astronomy and mathematics, divination books, treatises on art, material cultural and nature studies, plants and animals, books on miscellaneous issues, encyclopedias, novellas and stories, strange tales, Buddhist books and Taoist books. And in the fourth section, Jibu of belles-lettres and written collections, the poetry of the South, collections of individual writers from all different dynasties, anthologies and collections of literary critique, as well as poetry. So some of the highlights that we're going to talk about within the Siku Quanshu is the first one is the I Ching. There are many translations of the I Ching, and this is just one that I've taken from the internet to show you, as well as the symbols which are in the I Ching. I have 8 of them here to demonstrate to you what I'm going to discuss because it's a divination text with very old origins and from 1000 BC during the Zhou dynasty, and it has cosmological content and meaning. So they would have used back in ancient times bundles of straws to produce hexagrams with a total possible set of 64 hexagrams. And the I Ching, the Book of Changes, as it's also known, it's called the Book of Changes because of the changes that take place in the lines and the breaking of the lines and all the combinations, and that they would use these to divine the future by interpreting them. So in the Book of I Ching, it goes through all 64 hexagrams and the meanings of those hexagrams. You might have seen these symbols before because actually the flag of South Korea today has some of these hexagrams, also known as bagua, on their country's flag. And each of the hexagrams are interpreted in the Book of I Ching. Now, the I Ching was regarded as the first of the 5 classics of Chinese literature, and some scholars suggest that it might have parallels with Western linear algebra or computer science, which is an interesting fact. The second book that I'm going to talk about is the classic of poetry, also known as the Shijing or the Book of Songs. And there's an example of it. It's bound in the Chinese way that I referred to earlier, with the binding is threads here on the side that you can see. Now, this is also translated into English as the Book of Songs. It was elevated to the level of a classic and was also known as the 300 Songs, most of which are from the Western Zhou period, which was 1046 to 771 BCE. It's interesting to note that Confucius lived during this time. He lived from 551 to 479 BCE, and he was the famous scholar and teacher. Now, during that time, it was a very chaotic period in China, and he was seeking peace and harmony to be restored and a return to order. And that's reflected in a lot of the Confucian writings. But it's also Confucius who's believed to have undertaken an editing of this collection. And we're not sure who the poets were who created the poems, although some are associated with the Duke of Zhou. It is another one of the 5 classics. The 5 classics consist of the Book of Songs, Book of Documents, Book of Changes, which we just spoke about, the I Ching, Book of Rites, and the Spring and Autumn Annals. The third book, which I'm going to highlight, that's part of the Siku Quanshu, is Records of the Grand Historian, written by Sima Qian. In Chinese, this is called the Shiji. It was written in the late 2nd century BC to 1st century BC and contains the prehistory of China over a 2,500-year period. These records are regarded as the foundational text in Chinese civilization. In fact, when I was living in Taiwan and studying Chinese, we actually studied some of the passages from the records of the Grand Historian. And if you were able to, in this day, in 2024, if you're able to read Chinese traditional characters, you can also read the text, the original text of the Records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian. And I think this is kind of mind-blowing when you realize that, because there's certainly no way that we could read a text of English language from 2,000 years ago. So the original would have been written on bamboo strips, and then later copies were written on silk. Now, the way that the records of the Grand Historian were written, they served as the model for future dynastic histories. And it's interesting to note that Sima Qian, in his own words, when he was compiling information, said that, "I have set down only what is certain, and in doubtful cases, I have left a blank." I think this is a good approach to writing history, and we can learn from Sima Qian. Now, the tomb of Qin Huangdi, the first emperor of China, which had been the stuff of legends and was described in great detail by Sima Qian in his records, it actually turned out to be true that there was this tomb of Qin Huangdi, and it was discovered in 1974. So his records are considered quite reliable and accurate about ancient Chinese history. The fourth and final book that we're going to talk about is the Art of War by Sun Tzu, and it's known also as Sun Tzu's military method. This book dates roughly to the 5th century BC, and it could be argued is the most famous in the West, having been used by military leaders such as Mao Zedong to Douglas MacArthur and Norman Schwarzkopf Jr. It was translated into English in 1910, but had been translated by a French Jesuit priest as early as 1772. It has 13 chapters, each of which has a different theme of battle skills and strategy, including intelligence gathering and spying tactics. And Sima Qian, whom we've just spoken about, referred to a military text by a Sun Wu, and it's not known if this was the same person, Sun Tzu, but it very well could have been. So I have an image of the Penguin Classic translation of Sun Tzu, The Art of War, and then beneath it is a version of it on bamboo strips that dates to the Qianlong period in the 18th century. Now, this gentleman is standing in amongst that exhibition of the slide that I showed at the beginning of the talk tonight, and this is a reproduction, a new reproduction that he's holding. And so it's at this stage that I think it's important that we can talk about the significance of the Siku Quanshu in Chinese history. As mentioned earlier in the presentation, there are 4 extant manuscript handwritten copies. One of the copies that doesn't exist any longer was in the Summer Palace, the Yuanming Yuan, that was destroyed by French and British troops in 1860. And another one that was destroyed was during the Taiping Rebellion, which was a Chinese rebellion. But the 4 surviving copies are, number 1, there's a copy in the National Palace Museum, the Gugong Bo Yuan in Taipei, Taiwan. There's another copy in Lanzhou in the Gansu Library. A third copy resides in Beijing, in now the Beijing Library, which is the National Library of China. And there's a 4th copy in the Zhejiang Library, which was recollected by the Ding brothers in the 19th century. And it's quite a fun story about the Ding brothers. They were book collectors, and one day one of them was in the street market, and he bought a package of peanuts that were wrapped in actually a page of the Siku Quanshu, which had been damaged and stolen and dispersed during a rebellion in Hangzhou in 1854. So when the Ding brother, when he saw this, that his peanuts were wrapped in a page from the Siku Quanshu, and being a book collector, he and his brother searched out and bought back as much of the original Siku Quanshu version that had been stolen and damaged and lost during that rebellion. And he bought them back as much as he could. He recopied missing sections, and it was then given to the Zhejiang Library. And then in the 20th century, we will come to, at the end of the talk tonight, a discussion of how that version was saved in 1937. So it's interesting to note that although the books were censored and some of them were burned and parts of them were removed, an actual list of the forbidden books survives, as well as some of the actual books. So they weren't thorough, fortunately, for history in destroying all of those anti-Manchu sentiments that were in the books. But during the period of censorship, which was in the 1770s and 1780s. There are approximately 3,000 books that were censored because of anti-Manchu sentiment, and the list is called the Siku Jinshu, the 4 categories of prohibited books. Now, in 1935, the Shangwu Inshu Press reprinted a copy consisting of 231 books in 1,960 volumes. And in the 1960s, there were various series of the Siku Quanshu printed in Taiwan. In 1986, the whole version of the Wenyuan copy was reproduced in 1,500 volumes. And since then, there are now several digital versions that are accessible online. So what is the cultural, historical, and monetary value of the Siku Quanshu? This was a legacy project to solidify the Qianlong Emperor's position, not only amongst the Han Chinese literati, but also to ensure his status as the finest emperor of all time. He didn't do anything on a small scale, and whether it was his military conquest that resulted in the doubling of the Chinese Empire, his art collection and patronage, or while at the same time eliminating any anti-Manchu references in the body of his Chinese traditional culture in literature. The Qianlong Emperor was the fourth emperor of the conquering foreign Qing dynasty, and his father and grandfather and other ancestors who'd been offended and concerned about anti-Manchu sentiment hadn't taken action like Qianlong did. He took the bull by the horns and he led this project. He was also making a statement that of outdoing the previous Ming Dynasty encyclopedia, which was compiled by the Han Chinese Emperor Yongle in 1407, which consisted of approximately 370 million words. And the Siku Quanshu has approximately 997 million words. He wanted to prove his scholarship, his right to rule, and promote an image of himself as the finest emperor ever. Now, there's a whole area of study around the Siku Quanshu, and hundreds of PhD students, both past and present, have used it as a resource and used topics from it for research in and of itself. And the story I referred to, which comes from an article in the Time magazine in 2020, highlights the importance of the Siku Quanshu and the journey that one of the original copies from the Zhejiang library that the Ding brothers had reassembled. It was in 1937 in Nanjing University that students and staff were fleeing during the Second Sino-Japanese War. And it was considered so important to protect and save one of China's great treasures that they carried 230 boxes containing the copy of the Siku Quanshu by every means you can imagine, by wheelbarrow, on their backs, in boats across streams, and eventually even it did survive despite aerial bombardments. And one of the librarians from the Zhejiang University even sold his own home, borrowed money from friends and family to fund the transportation of the library. And it fortunately did survive. So, although none of the original copies has ever been sold, culturally, it is prized as containing the millennia of Chinese history and literature, and in terms of monetary value, can only be considered priceless. And the last slide we have is the bibliography and resources. I've put down a few of the digital versions that are available online of the Siku Quanshu, the first being the Library of Congress, as well as a wonderful guide offered by Georgetown University in English on how to research using the Siku Quanshu, and that's in both English and Chinese. I have a book that is a very detailed, in-depth very scholarly inquiry about how scholars related to Qianlong during that time period and the state and the government, and it's by Kent Guy. So that's another interesting book that might be of people might want to follow up with and read. There are a few others that I referred to in my lecture tonight, and one was The Risky Journey That Saved a Chinese Literary Treasure from the Time magazine, as well as, of course, what the title implied is Wikipedia is an excellent source for researching the original Wikipedia under titles involving the Qianlong Emperor, Siku Quanshu, the Manchus, the records of the Grand Historian, etc. So thank you very much for joining us this evening.
All right. So now this takes us to our next portion, which will be a live Q&A here. So we will suggest you use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen there as we get wait for some questions to come in. And we have Susan here with us live to answer some of those. And I guess to get us kind of started off, I know you kind of teased at this during the program as well, Susan, the JP Morgan story that you mentioned, and how did the Imperial Art Collection almost end up with JP Morgan in New York City? And we have one of our slides here, a photo of the library, which is in Manhattan there.
Thank you very much, Lee. Can you see me and hear me okay? Very
Yep,
good.
we got you loud and clear.
Okay, excellent. Well, it's a really exciting story. And many years ago, I attended regularly the Asia Week, which is a whole week of Asian art sales in New York City. And pre-pandemic, people would fly in from all over the world, and they would coordinate exhibitions and lectures in New York to do with Asian art themes. And so one March many years ago, I attended the J.P. Morgan Library and Museum in New York. And if you haven't visited the J.P. Morgan Library, I suggest that it's really worth a visit. First of all, they have this incredible library, I'm sure, filled with all kinds of manuscripts. But the exhibition at that time was of the telegrams that had been sent between J.P. Morgan and the imperial family in China in 1913, and J.P. Morgan, the famous industrialist and financier in the States, had been in negotiations with the imperial family to purchase the entire collection that was in the Forbidden City. Now, the Qing dynasty ended in 1911, and this took place in 1913. And the telegrams that J.P. Morgan had been a tremendous collector of Chinese porcelains. And at one point, he had over 1,800 Chinese porcelains prior to his death. Unfortunately, now only in the Morgan Library and Museum, they have one example of one of his porcelains, and it's a Chinese vase with a what's called sang de boeuf, which is ox blood colored red glaze. And but they also have the telegrams there. Now, the telegrams of these negotiations were they were in code, so that anybody who was sending the telegrams and all the people, if you can imagine the people delivering the telegrams, nobody could read these telegrams except for J.P. Morgan and the other negotiator at the other end in China, who had the codes to decipher these telegrams. But in these telegrams, J.P. Morgan was offering $4 million US, which in 1913 was a lot of money, to acquire the entire collection. Because in 1913 and the Qing dynasty ending in 1911, the imperial family was really in dire straits. They didn't have money to survive. So they were seriously considering selling the collection for $4 million. Now, as timing would have it in life, what happened was JP Morgan was traveling and he was in Rome, Italy at the time. And literally just 3 days before the final agreement to sell the collection, he died. And so the transaction was never processed, literally because of just a difference of a few days. If he'd lived for a few more days, then the entire collection of Imperial China would have ended up in New York City with J.P. Morgan. So I think that's kind of cool how things work out in life. And as it was, they were selling off. They continued to sell off pieces from the collection. About one third of the collection ended up in England with a famous collector of Chinese porcelain by the name of Sir Percival David. He got about a third of the collection, and other parts of the collections were dispersed. But the bulk of the collection still remained in China until the Kuomintang army was retreating from the communists who won the Civil War, and they retreated to Taiwan. And there was a whole journey. They basically took the bulk of the Chinese collection to Taipei, Taiwan, and it's now in the National Palace Museum in Taipei.
Wow, great. And yeah, Brad asks, and kind of following up with that is asking if you could talk a bit more about the four different copies that you mentioned during this, and are they all from the same period, or is there one that is older or possibly more contemporary to the original? You said there were seven made originally, and then
Yes.
four of which exist.
Yes. So
Yeah,
they were all produced within about 10 years. So basically, they're all considered the originals were all made at the same time, originally back in the 1770s. So it
fantastic. And
took,
I imagine it takes a while to write all of
yes,
that
yes,
out
it
by
takes
hand.
a while to hand copy each of those. So they weren't all produced at exactly the same time, but they are considered to all be contemporary at that from that period.
Fantastic. And Shirley asks about the. She said, "I saw 2 pages on your slide, or two, yeah, two. I saw the 2 pages on your slide of the pages. The characters are different colors. Do they correspond with the categories to which they belong?" And I can see if I can share the one of the gentleman holding these. So you see there's the different colors there, but and you also had it color coded in your.
Mm.
Let me see if
Yes.
I can go
No,
back as
actually,
well. When you
I
four sections as well.
that's a really good question and an interesting observation. The copy that that gentleman is holding up is a brand new reproduction, printed reproduction. It's not hand done. And it's 20th century. It's contemporary to when around the time when they had this exhibition. So I that's an excellent question, and I honestly I can't answer that because in terms of what the different blues and reds and blacks are here, but. It is not corresponding to the four colors of the four categories because the four colors would originally the bindings were if they belonged in one category, say the first category of red, they would all be red. Or green was the first category, red is the second category, blue is the third, and gray is the fourth. So that you could easily, and they were colored according to the seasons, but you could easily then look at the whole collection of Siku Quanshu and immediately recognize by the bindings which ones were belonged to which category, right? So that was that part of that color coding. But this photo with the different colored fonts in it, I'm not quite sure why that is the case there. But excellent
All right.
question. So
Yeah, and I guess kind of follow up on that. So this copy at the minute that Brad follows up on is this is a scan. Would this be a scan? Would this look as the originals would have looked then?
yes, they would write a certain number of characters on each line, and this is a quite true to the original reproduction of it. Yes, and you
Right.
can find these reproductions. They're all online now. They're digital copies, and they're in English and in Chinese, and you can do research in both languages on the collection.
Great. Yeah, and that is fantastic. So then on my question slide here, this is the cover. Then these would be the closed covers of those books,
Yes,
these sewn
so
covers.
the red ones. Yeah.
Great. All right. And there was one more thing. Let's see.
There was
Any if
another
there's any other
question, I
question.
think, about the accuracy and reliability of the information in the Sekuchuanshu, and
Absolutely.
that it is really exciting to know that. I gave one example in my talk about how in 1974 they actually discovered the tomb that Sima Qian had described back in the Han Dynasty, which was 2,000 years ago, and all of his descriptions turned out to be true. So I think that's really important that and he was working from texts that were very old at the time when he was living in the BC. And I have on the glossary here. I have information about when some of the people lived that I mentioned, and I know that when I was speaking, it's hard to know how to spell the names. That's why I provided the glossary. So on the list on the glossary, it points out towards the end of the first page, Sima Qian lived from 145 to 86 BC. So he was using records that were already several hundred years old when he was compiling the records of the Grand Historian. But it's really interesting to read English translations of these texts. And I think there's another. I can talk a little bit more about the language because the language, in terms of the written language, originally until 1956, everyone learned traditional characters. So there's two types of Chinese characters. There's traditional and there's simplified. And so when Mao took over in China, which was October 1st, 1949, they wanted to simplify the language, the written language, so that more people, and there were many illiterate peasants, that millions that they wanted to educate. So they decided that they were going to change and remove strokes in the individual characters to try and make it easier to learn. So in 1956, they started using simplified characters in mainland China, and then more characters were simplified in 1964 and 1978 and 1984. So if you are a young person today and you were born post 1956, you likely are unable to read traditional characters. So the Chinese language, as it evolved over the centuries, there were at least 11 different dialects. So there's Hunanese and Shanghaiese and Fujianese and Mandarin and all of these different dialects. But prior to 1956, people were able to read the same newspaper, even though they couldn't understand, like Cantonese is different from Mandarin. There's different number of tones in the language. And so but they could read the same newspaper, but that's not the case today. But today, you can learn at university traditional or simplified. And in Hong Kong and Taiwan and Singapore, they still use the traditional characters. So when I was at university and taking first year Mandarin Chinese, they said, okay, everybody learns the basic traditional characters, and then after first year you had to decide, are you going to continue with the traditional characters, or you continue with simplified characters? And I chose to continue with traditional characters so I could still access the ancient texts and read the history in its original form. So I
Wow.
think that's important to know. And there are two different styles of romanizing Chinese words in English. And the Siku Quanshu, spelled Siku Quansuh, is actually the modern romanization called pinyin. And I put on the glossary the traditional way of spelling it with what's called the Wade Giles romanization, and it's spelled quite differently. So if you're researching the Siku Quanshu, you might come up with finding it spelled SS apostrophe U hyphen K apostrophe U CH apostrophe U with an umlaut AN hyphen SUSHU. So they're the same text. It's just that they're written in English. They're romanized two different ways. So I just thought I'd point that out in case people, because if, for example, if you were to look at the book that I held up before, the Kent Guy book, he actually uses the old version, the Wei Zhao's version of spelling things, and even the Qianlong Emperor's name is spelt differently, but it's still the Qianlong Emperor. So one is considered old-fashioned, the other one is the pinyin romanization, which we use today. And I'm not sure if you want to show, we have a couple of slides that show a jade object that is engraved with one of the Qianlong Emperor's
Yeah,
poems.
fantastic. You mentioned this was one of his poems that he had.
Yes.
Am I
Yes.
correct?
So he had a tremendous collection of thousands of pieces of jades. So now some people might think that this is not a good thing that he did this. I guess we just have to accept that he did. But the jade bee, it's a ritual object. We're not quite sure what it represented, but it's been found in the tombs, ancient tombs. So it was a disc and with a hole in the center. Maybe it has something to do with the sun or cosmology, uh, the cosmos. But this disc is actually from the Shang Dynasty. So it's very, very, very old. So it's from the Shang Dynasty, which is around, I'll show you from another book here. There's a great book if you're interested in learning more about Chinese marks and things by Gerald Davison. There's the dates here for the Shang Dynasty were circa 1600 to 1028 BC. And so the Qianlong Emperor took one of his own poems and had it engraved in gold on this ancient object that was in his collection. And he's from the 18th century putting it on a Shang Dynasty object. So I think that this speaks to, though, how educated the emperors were. And so, and if you contrast that to politicians today, and rulers today. I wonder what the world would be like if our politicians and rulers and kings today had to be able to write poetry, be able to paint exquisitely, and just to be well rounded in philosophy and history and all these different areas in order to be an emperor, for example. And there's one more that I think connects us and wraps things up nicely with his
For sure. And I
Manchu.
just to add in real quick,
Yeah,
I said Brad had asked about
yeah.
and maybe just add just to the size of this object. And Brad asked, could this be one of a scroll, like of holding the scroll, like the paper in place? Like what's the size of this object here?
They vary, and jade comes in all different colors, and the bee objects come in all different sizes. So, and some are thick and some are thin, and you have to keep in mind that when they were making these, this was before tools, and this was all hand done, and they somehow managed to make these exquisite works of art. So this one, it could be around that big. Like they could be small. People could even wear a bee on their neck, but this one is big enough, like maybe the size, this one is about the size of a dinner plate, right?
Oh
With a
wow.
hole in the center. So they come in all different sizes and all different sizes of holes too. Some of the holes on them are larger, some are smaller, and this one has a little rim on it, and oftentimes they don't have a rim on them. So all different shapes and sizes. So
Wow.
that's what's exciting
That's
about these
great.
JB. Yeah.
Yeah, and then so you said this kind of ties in with our last slide that we had prepared, more of the art and
Yes.
that side of.
Yes. Before we talk about the very last slide, I've brought two more books to share with you because I love history and I love art, and there are a couple of really great books that you might want to research yourself. And one is The History of the World in 100 Objects. So it's by Neil McGregor. The History of the World in 100 Objects, and this is the based on the celebrated BBC Radio 4 series, and it goes through civilization basically, and then it picks objects to describe and talk about that reflect some important aspect of human development and history and art. And so, and there are lots of Chinese objects in here, including a pair of the very famous blue and white David vases named after Sir Percival David, who I just mentioned, who ended up with about a third of the imperial collection. And these are from the Yuan dynasty. You can see those in the British Museum. So, A History of the World in 100 Objects. And then there's another great book, kind of similar. It's put out by the British Museum by a well-known Chinese scholar, a scholar in Chinese art by the name of Jessica Harrison Hall. And her book is called China, A History in Objects. And again, it goes through the history of China specifically. One is of the world, and then one is of China specifically. Through objects, we learn about the history. And then if we want to look at the very last slide, it is one example. I chose it because it has the antlers, and I can imagine the Emperor Qianlong having hunted and killed deer, etc., while hunting. And then this is like an analysis, a study of the antlers from a particular one of the deer that he had hunted, and then his various seal marks, different shapes, different sizes. We talked about how in the Siku Quanshu, the type of script used was the Kaishu, and the type of script used in these red seal marks are actually archaic script based on pictograms from the Shang dynasty. But again, every emperor, some emperors painted beautiful paintings of birds and flowers and landscapes, and he did as well. But I thought this one connected with his Manchu heritage nicely to share with you at the very end. So thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure presenting to you this evening on the Siku Quanshu.
Thank you so much. Yes, you can. Your depth on this could go on for hours, I'm sure. So we thank you so much for your time and all the preparation that you've put into this here at the Manuscript Society. And we will. This recording will be made available on the website. If you go to manuscript.org, you can see what's going on next. But again, Susan Leahy, everyone, thank you so much for attending. Thank you, Susan, for all your time. And we will see you all on the next event. Have a great night.